The document surfaced in 2019, concealed within the wall of a raised plantation manor in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Construction laborers discovered it encased in oilcloth. The ink had paled but remained readable. It was a letter penned in 1831 by a white supervisor named Edmund Hale to his sibling in Charleston. The message recounted something that terrified him so profoundly he never posted it, choosing instead to hide it where no soul would find it during his life. "There is a Negro here," Hale wrote, "who possesses knowledge he should not have. He speaks of occurrences before they materialize. The slaves believe he bears the spirits of his predecessors in his blood. I have flogged him until my arm grew weary, and yet he gazes at me with eyes that perceive through time itself. I dread this man, William. I dread him more than any living creature." The man's name, based on plantation logs cross-referenced with Hale's writing, was entered as Jim in the ledger. But that was not his true identity. His real name was Jabari Mansa, and what transpired with him represents one of the most purposefully erased chronicles in American history. Because Jabari did not merely resist bondage through flight or physical insurrection, he resisted through something far more lethal to the system that held him captive. He refused to allow them to seize his mind. What you are about to hear has been submerged for nearly 200 years. The files were liquidated, the witnesses gagged, and the tale itself was regarded as too volatile to keep. But shards survived. Legal papers, auction bills, letters like Hale's that were secreted away rather than burnt. Testimony from enslaved individuals recorded decades after liberation by investigators who recognized that oral tradition held truths that formal records intentionally bypassed. And when you assemble these fragments, they disclose something that plantation owners in the 1800s grasped but could never confess openly: that the most perilous slave was not the one who fled or fought, but the one who remembered. Jabari Mansa reached Charleston Harbor in August 1807, just weeks before the act banning the importation of slaves would officially terminate the legal Atlantic slave trade to the United States. The vessel was the Henrietta Marie, a Portuguese ship that had sailed under a Spanish flag to evade growing British naval blockades. Archives indicate 312 Africans boarded that ship on the coast of modern-day Senegal. Only 127 survived the voyage. The remainder were cast overboard, their remains feeding sharks that learned to trail slave ships across the Atlantic like scavengers following an battalion. But we are not beginning there. We are beginning 37 years afterward in 1844 with what occurred in the timberlands outside Beaufort when Jabari did something that would be scrutinized by 3 distinct court probes and eventually lead to statutes specifically crafted to stop anyone from ever repeating it. The event involved 12 enslaved people from various plantations who gathered in secret on a Sabbath night. What they performed during that session depends on who tells the story. The white authorities asserted it was a mystical ceremony intended to hex plantation owners. The enslaved community maintained it was a teaching where Jabari was transmitting knowledge that had to survive. But everyone concurred on one point after that evening. 2 of the white men who stumbled upon the assembly went gradually mad, speaking in tongues they had never studied, describing lands they had never visited, unable to tell their own thoughts from premonitions of things that had yet to happen. The legal system called it mania. The enslaved people called it retribution. And Jabari Mansa, when interrogated under duress about what he had done, remarked only this: "I showed them what we recall, and memory is a weapon they cannot confiscate." To grasp what he intended, you must understand where Jabari originated and what he carried with him that proved more hazardous than any blade or firearm. The Wolof Empire in what is now Senegal maintained a verbal tradition reaching back centuries. They had griots, master chroniclers who committed to memory the entire history of realms. the lineage of governing families, and the wisdom gathered over ages. These men were not merely performers, they were walking archives. Their minds held data that would take years to write down if anyone had recorded it. But the Wolof purposefully kept this wisdom oral because parchment could be incinerated, stolen, or forged. Human memory, trained and sharpened, proved more steadfast than any vault. Jabari's grandfather had been a griot, not of the highest station, but honored enough that his kin held status. They were not royalty, but they were not tillers or laborers either. They lived in that middle stratum of African society that white traffickers found most lucrative, educated enough to be prized, but not influential enough to be shielded. When French and Portuguese merchants established their outposts along the Senegalese shore, they paid local leaders to supply prisoners from this specific social tier. Intelligent enough to be functional, isolated enough to be disposable. Jabari was 17 when the hunters arrived. This was not a haphazard strike or a village skirmish. This was commerce. The local leader, whose name history has conveniently discarded, had inked a deal to provide 50 young men to a Portuguese merchant named Valentim da Silva. The agreement mandated ages between 15 and 25, physically robust, with no apparent ailments or flaws. Da Silva paid in fabrics, spirits, and iron rods, the standard tender of the human trade, and the leader's men picked their marks with the exactness of people filling a trade order. They captured Jabari during the parched season when young men trekked to fishing hamlets near the coast to swap wares. There were 6 of them, all from families with some level of learning or craft. The leader's men did not seize random peasants, they seized future pioneers, people who would have become educators, officials, or traders, people whose intellect and wit could be turned into labor capital on American soil. The holding cage near the shore was a stone stronghold the Portuguese had constructed solely for processing human freight. It was not a jail in the usual sense. It was a depot. The prisoners were shackled in massive chambers, provided minimal sustenance, and kept breathing just long enough to be moved to the vessels anchored offshore. During those 3 weeks in the stronghold, Jabari observed as the mental breaking began before the physical trek even commenced. Some prisoners shattered immediately, sliding into a catatonic daze. Others grew frantic, striking the guards, even though it meant certain execution. But most did as Jabari did. They watched, they noted specifics. They tried to fathom the machinery that had consumed them so they might find some way to endure or find a flaw. This was not about heroism, it was about strategy. Soldiers who did not analyze their rivals died swiftly. During those 3 weeks, Jabari met a man who shifted his view of what defiance could look like. The man was senior, perhaps 40, and had been a griot of much higher standing than Jabari's grandfather. His name was Boubacar, and he had been taken specifically because a rival political group had sold him to Portuguese agents to remove his power. Boubacar realized something that Jabari at 17 had not yet fully perceived. They were not just stealing bodies. They were trying to wipe out cultures, dialects, and entire eras of gathered wisdom. "Listen to me closely," Boubacar whispered, during one of the rare times the guards were distracted. "They will try to force you to forget your name. They will try to strip your tongue. They will strike you until you believe you are what they call you. But if you can keep your recollections whole, if you can protect what you know about who you were before they seized you, you possess something they cannot ruin. Memory is not a flaw. Memory is the only tool that outlasts every strike." This was not a lecture on hope or eventual liberty. Boubacar was too pragmatic for that. He was instructing a specific survival method, the safeguarding of selfhood through intentional mental work. In the same way a griot masters thousands of lines of ancestry, Jabari would need to master everything about himself that the slave machinery would try to delete. his family's roots, the terrain of his birthplace, the tales his grandfather told, the flavor of the meals he ate, the rhythm of his mother's speech, the exact way the sun rose over the Senegal River. They will take your autonomy, Boubacar went on. They will take your frame, but your mind is yours until you yield it. And if enough of us refuse to yield, if we keep recalling and sharing what we recall, they cannot completely triumph. They can bind us, but they cannot erase us. 3 days later, Boubacar expired. The formal cause was noted as dysentery, but the other captives knew better. He had simply ceased the struggle to live, his body surrendering even though his mind stayed sharp until the end. Before he passed, he made Jabari vow a specific thing. Recall everything, not just your own chronicle, but mine. My name was Boubacar Dio, son of Madou Dio, griot of the Wolof court. I was born in 1767 during the rule of, and he stated his full lineage stretching back 7 generations. Jabari learned every syllable. When the Henrietta Marie left the African coast with its cargo of 312 souls, Jabari carried something in his head that the vessel's master, Antonio Fernandez, would never suspect existed. He carried the full genealogical charts of 2 Wolof houses, oral chronicles of Senegalese empires, and the methodical technique of how to maintain memory under conditions meant to ruin it. This information would prove far more threatening to American slavery than any blade. The Middle Passage was exactly the nightmare you have read about in every record of the trade. A systematic atrocity designed to keep the highest number of bodies alive while spending the least on their transit. Jabari was bound in the hold. For 11 weeks, his motion so limited that his limbs began to waste away. The ship's medic, a man named Dr. Henrik Costa, maintained precise logs of the voyage. These logs survived and were later obtained by anti-slavery activists. They are chilling to read, not for any graphic violence, but for their cold neutrality. Day 23. 5 Negroes expired in the night, likely from the flux, tossed bodies over at sunrise. Day 30. Storm damage to the forward hold. Waterfowling affecting nearly 40 Negroes, expect death rate to climb. Day 47, fever spreading, isolated the sick to stop a wider outbreak. 12 gone. Day 66, rations sufficient. Water low but enough for the projected arrival. What these logs fail to note is what happened in the spirits of the people bound in that blackness. The mental collapse that follows, prolonged sensory lack, the stench of rot and waste, the cries of those losing their grip on reality, the awareness that you are being moved to a place worse than this pit. But Jabari had Boubacar's guidance. During those 11 weeks, while his body failed nearly to the point of death, his mind was busy with a defiant act of conservation. He went over everything he had learned, every name in his bloodline, every tale his grandfather told, every physical detail of his home. When he finished his own past, he went through Boubacar's lineage, the one he had learned before the old griot died. When he finished that, he started learning new things. The faces of those bound near him, the rhythm of the ship's daily chores, the specific words the Portuguese crew used when delivering food or checking the freight. This was not optimism. It was a skill. He was purposefully training his mind like a runner trains muscle, keeping it active despite an environment intended to destroy thought. Other prisoners saw what Jabari was doing. A woman bound near him, whose name he would later find was Aminata, asked why he was always muttering. When he told her, she understood at once. She was a merchant's daughter, schooled in math and bookkeeping. She started her own mental work, reciting prices and trade paths and client names from her father's trade. Then she taught these to Jabari, and he taught her his histories without a word of debate. They were building a small underground network of shared recollection, ensuring that if one died, the other would take both sets of truths forward. When the Henrietta Marie arrived in Charleston Harbor in August 1807, 127 prisoners had survived. Jabari was so physically ravaged that the ship's medic first marked him as potentially unfit for trade. But after 3 days of better food and forced activity on the deck, Jabari regained enough strength to be led to the auction block. The traders had found that buyers wanted to check the goods closely, so there was always a period of mending between docking and the sale, time for the freight to look like viable labor again. The auction took place at Ryan's Mart on Chalmers Street. The site still stands as a museum, but in 1807 it was one of the busiest markets on the coast. The process was cold and documented. Every captive was given a lot number, checked by buyers, and sold to the highest offer. The checks were dehumanizing in ways history books often gloss over. White men checked teeth, gripped muscles, and looked at private parts, searching for any hint of illness or flaw that might drop the price. Jabari was bought by a rice farm owner named Marcus Whitfield for $720, which was slightly above the normal rate for a young male field hand. Whitfield ran a massive plantation on the coast near Beaufort, where rice farming required heavy labor in conditions that killed people at terrible rates. The swampy fields were nests for malaria and yellow fever. The work was physically crushing, and the isolation of these coastal farms meant supervisors had less oversight than those near cities. The plantation logs still exist in the South Carolina Historical Society. They show Jabari's arrival, noted as Negro Jim, bought in Charleston, August 1807, set to fieldwork, no known skills. That record shows everything wrong with how bondage tried to define human beings. Jabari arrived with 17 years of schooling in oral history, the equivalent of high-level training in his grandfather's craft. He spoke 3 tongues. He could recite epics that would fill books if written down. But to Marcus Whitfield, he was just Negro Jim, no known skills. What followed, the way Jabari began his unique brand of resistance, did not start with a loud act but with a quiet choice during his first week on the Whitfield land. The supervisor, a man named Thomas Brennan, was teaching work duties through a mix of pointing and pain. He spoke no African dialects, and none of the new arrivals knew English. So he talked through striking anyone who did not immediately grasp what was needed. This was the usual way, the breaking time where new slaves learned their spot through routine cruelty. On the 3rd day, Brennan was showing how to set rice plants in the swampy fields. He did the motion once, then shoved an African man into the mud and struck him with a staff until the man tried to copy the move. When it was Jabari's turn, he executed the movement flawlessly on the first attempt, having observed precisely what Brennan desired. This ought to have pleased the overseer. Instead, it disturbed him. The expression in Jabari's eyes indicated a comprehension that surpassed mere mimicry. It suggested a mind actively gaining knowledge, not a creature being broken through drill. "You watching me, boy?" Brennan remarked, though Jabari could not yet grasp the English speech. "You think you're clever?" Jabari kept eye contact, which was in itself a gesture of resistance. Captive people were expected to cast their gaze downward when white men spoke to them. But Jabari had been instructed by his grandfather that a man who drops his eyes has already forfeited his pride. So he stared straight at Brennan, his face calm, revealing nothing but refusing to perform the servility that was demanded. Brennan hit him across the face. Jabari did not flinch or scream. He simply continued to hold the gaze. Brennan hit him again with more force. Jabari's face did not shift. This standoff persisted for perhaps 30 seconds before Brennan sensed he was losing something more vital than physical control. The other laborers were looking on. If he kept beating a man who refused to display agony or surrender, he would prove that violence had boundaries, that certain things could not be crushed out of a human being. So Brennan made a tactical withdrawal, commanding Jabari back to labor and making a silent note that this specific African required close monitoring. That night, Brennan wrote in his ledger, "New Negro from Charleston Sale displays rebellious spirit. Suggest harsh discipline to stop influence on others." This note would be the first of many documenting the overseer's rising dread of a man who performed as told but somehow kept an internal world that no amount of brutality could reach. That evening, bound in the quarters, Jabari began to instruct. He spoke quietly in Wolof to the other African-born captives nearby. Not all of them grasped his tongue, but several did. And to those who understood, he explained what Boubacar had shared with him. They would attempt to seize everything, your name, your speech, your sense of identity before you were caught. But memory was a landscape they could not entirely seize. If you intentionally remembered and shared what you knew with others, you built pockets of defiance that lived solely in the mind. "My name is Jabari Mansa," he stated, son of Kwame Mansa, grandson of Fode Mansa, who was a leader of the Wolof people. "I was born in," and he spoke his full lineage the same way he'd been reciting during the Middle Passage. Then he spoke Boubacar's lineage. Then he requested each person there to tell him their true names, where they originated, and anything they recalled about their families, and he burned every word into his mind. This was the beginning, not with a flight to freedom or a bloody revolt, but with the methodical protection of selfhood through shared recollection. Within 14 days, there were 15 people on the Whitfield estate participating in this habit. They would labor in the rice fields during the day, doing the harsh work required. But at night, they spoke their histories to one another, building a collective store of African selfhood that existed only in their thoughts. Marcus Whitfield had no clue this was occurring. Neither did Brennan. They saw laborers who followed orders and did their jobs. They did not see the nightly circles where people spoke in African tongues, saving knowledge that the plantation system assumed would vanish with the first generation of African-born captives. They did not grasp that defiance could take shapes that looked nothing like mutiny, and they certainly did not foresee what would occur when Jabari began teaching the youngsters. The Whitfield estate had roughly 80 captives, including children born there to African mothers and American-born fathers. These youths grew up speaking English as their first language, Christianity as their sole faith, and estate life as the only world they recognized. From the white view, second-generation slaves were perfect. They had no first-hand memory of Africa, no alternative cultural map, and could be molded entirely by the system. But Jabari saw these children as the true contest. If African culture could be saved and passed to American-born children, the system's power to wipe out African identity across decades would break. So he started a quiet, methodical mission of schooling that would take years to show results and decades to reach its full, lethal potential. I need you to grasp something before we proceed with what happened next. Be sure to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this account. Leave a comment saying where you're watching from and subscribe, because what happens next in Jabari's life is grimmer than anything we've touched on so far. The schooling happened in bits and pieces, never in ways that white overseers would view as instruction. Jabari would be working in the rice fields beside a 10-year-old child born on the farm, and he would say, seemingly to himself but loud enough for the youth to hear, "In my home, we called this plant something else. We called it malo. And the way we made it for eating was," and he would outline in careful detail West African cooking styles while appearing to simply mutter to himself during labor. Or he would be passing the children's quarters in the dusk and stop to tell a tale, framing it as amusement. "Let me tell you about a hero named Sundiata," he would say, and then speak the saga of the Mali Empire's creator, a story his grandfather had given him. To White Watchers, if they noticed at all, it looked like an old African telling fables. To the children hearing it, it was something much more potent, proof that there was a world and a past beyond the fences, that their forebears had been something other than property. The plantation system had a deep crack built into its base. It required treating people as objects rather than humans, which meant white owners seldom noticed the complex social and cultural lives that captive communities built in their quiet spaces. As long as tasks were finished and no clear revolt broke out, overseers did not worry about what people discussed among themselves. This lack of sight created room for resistance that the system's makers never expected. Within 5 years of Jabari's arrival at the Whitfield farm, something incredible had taken place. Roughly 30 people, including 15 children, could recite large portions of West African spoken history. They knew the lineages of many families. They could speak primary phrases in Wolof, Mandinka, and Fulani, tongues that most of them had never heard before Jabari's lessons. And most threatening of all, they understood that their status was not a natural state, but a wrong done against them by people who had no moral claim to their sweat. This last point was what truly scared white owners when they finally found out what was happening. The system leaned on people believing their own lower status, thinking on some level that their condition was meant to be or naturally right. Schooling that clearly taught otherwise was more dangerous than any blade because it shook the mental base that made mass bondage possible with relatively little physical force. Marcus Whitfield did not see the shift at first, but Thomas Brennan, who spent every day directly watching the labor, began to feel something changing in the social air. The laborers were doing their jobs well enough, but there was a tone to their compliance that felt different, less crushed, more like people choosing to work for now rather than people who had accepted their lot forever. He could not put this feeling into words clearly enough to tell Whitfield. It was more a gut feeling than proof, but it made him edgy. In 1812, 5 years after Jabari came, Brennan finally saw what was bothering him. He caught a conversation between 2 children born on the farm, maybe 8 and 10 years old, speaking in a tongue that certainly was not English. When he challenged them, asking where they had picked up African speech, the children claimed they did not know what he meant. But Brennan was not foolish. He realized instantly that someone was instructing, and he had a firm hunch who that person was. The African he had marked as stubborn during the first week, the one who held eye contact, who showed no terror during strikes, who worked well but somehow never seemed tamed. That man had been leading a 5-year mission of cultural protection right under the overseer's nose. Brennan took this news to Whitfield, who first brushed it off as a wild guess, but Brennan pushed for a test. He brought several of the youths to the big house and had them grilled separately about where they had learned African words. The children, with the survival skills that captive people formed from birth, lied expertly. They claimed they had heard their mothers singing tunes in African tongues they did not grasp, that they were just mimicking sounds without thought, that they had no clue what the words meant. This story was believable enough that Whitfield could not definitely prove purposeful teaching was happening, but it stirred his doubt enough that he commanded more watching of Jabari specifically. For the next 2 months, Brennan tracked Jabari constantly. He put him on lonely work tasks to keep him away from others. He shifted his sleeping spot to a different shack. He set rules banning talk during work hours. None of it changed anything. The lessons had already sprouted. 30 people had stored what Jabari taught them, and they kept teaching each other even when Jabari could not personally join in. The circle had become independent. This was Jabari's true brilliance as a leader. He had not built a system that leaned on his own presence. He taught a way of being that others could do on their own. Every person who learned his memory ways became a teacher able to save and pass on knowledge. The estate could beat Jabari to death, and the defiance would go on because it lived in dozens of hearts rather than one. In 1814, Marcus Whitfield sold Jabari to a trader named Harrison Webb. The sale was not a penalty for any one act. Whitfield simply wanted this specific man off his land. He had become sure, without being able to prove it, that Jabari's presence was somehow infecting the others, making them harder to control. Better to sell him at a loss than risk whatever power he was using. The sale pulled Jabari from the group he had spent 7 years building. This was one of the most effective tools of the system, the constant threat of being torn from family and moved, which stopped long-term planning. But Jabari had foreseen this chance. Before the sale took place, he had spent months getting the others ready for his departure. "Memory does not need my face," he told them. "Everything I have shared stays in your minds now. Teach your children. Teach anyone who will hear, and if we never meet again, we are still tied together through the truth we hold." Harrison Webb ran what was known as a slave coffle, a moving jail that moved people from the coast to inland farms where the need and price were higher. Webb's plan was simple and cruel. Buy people in Charleston or Savannah, chain them in a row, and walk them several hundred miles to markets in Georgia, Alabama, or Mississippi. The trip usually took 6 to 8 weeks and killed about 10% of the group through sickness, harm, or fatigue. Jabari was bound in a line with 43 other people. Most of them were fresh arrivals from Africa who spoke no English and had no idea where they were being led or why. The march started in Charleston and moved west toward Alabama, taking paths that avoided big towns where people might try to stop them. Webb's way was to move the line mostly at night, rest during the day in hidden camps, and keep everyone bound except for short breaks. During this 2-month walk, Jabari did what might be the most striking act of his struggle. He methodically memorized the life of every person in that line. 43 people's names, roots, families, talents, and memories. He built a mental vault of 43 African identities that the system meant to wipe out, and he began teaching them his ways of saving memory during the evening breaks when Webb allowed quiet talk. Most of these people would pass away on Alabama cotton farms within 10 years. Their frames would be worked to the limit and placed in nameless pits. Their names would be lost. Their kin would never know their fate, and history would mark them as nothing but loss of stock in farm books. But for 2 months in 1814, they had someone who heard their tales and remembered, someone who viewed them as whole humans with pasts worth saving. And many of them learned enough of Jabari's ways to keep that habit going, building small webs of defiance on whatever lands they reached. The line reached Montgomery, Alabama in October 1814. Webb sold most of his group at a sale there, but Jabari and 7 others were moved another 100 miles to a cotton estate owned by Samuel Crawford. Crawford's land was huge, even for Alabama. Nearly 3,000 acres worked by over 200 people. The size was shocking. This was not a small farm. It was a factory that turned humans into cotton with cold precision. The state of things on Crawford's land was much worse than what Jabari had seen at Whitfield's rice farm. Cotton work needed labor all year. During the planting time, people worked 16-hour days clearing earth and sowing seeds. During the growing time, they kept the fields clean through non-stop weeding and bug control. During the pick, they gathered cotton from light until they dropped from exhaustion, with daily goals that rose every year as overseers found new ways to push them. And during the cleaning time, they worked the gins in air that ruined lungs with floating fibers. The estate's overseer was Jacob Reeves, and he ran the place with a level of planned cruelty that made Thomas Brennan seem mild. Reeves had a belief that the most work came from keeping people in a state of fear, just below the point of fighting back. He kept precise logs of every person's work, punished any who missed the goal, and did random beatings to make sure even the best workers never felt safe. His books, which lasted and are now in the archives at Auburn University, are truly haunting. Pages of cold pain, written with the same focus a scientist might give to a study. Jabari's arrival at Crawford's Land happened to match a moment that would build his name among the community there. During his first week, a young woman named Sarah fell in the fields from the heat. Reeves's move was to have her pulled to the edge of the field and beaten for faking, a standard penalty meant to stop others from trying to miss work through false sickness. Jabari, who was working close by and had seen Sarah fall, said something that none of the others had ever heard an African say to a white overseer. "She needs water and shade. She will perish otherwise." Reeves looked at Jabari with a face of pure shock. New arrivals, especially African-born ones who spoke little English, did not give medical tips or orders to white men. The social rule demanded total silence. By speaking at all without being told, Jabari had committed a crime that would normally bring a heavy beating. "What did you say, boy?" Jabari said it again, this time in better English that showed 7 years of learning. "The woman needs water and shade. What you call heat sickness will kill her in an hour if not helped. I have seen this before." The others expected Reeves to hit Jabari until he was out for this talk. Instead, something weirder happened. Reeves, despite his usual cruelty, saw that this man was different. He was speaking with the certainty of someone giving a professional view, not the shaking whisper of someone trying to dodge a blow. And Reeves, under his mean streak, knew enough about cotton work to know that replacing dead laborers cost money. "You know medicine?" Reeves asked. Jabari did not, in a formal way, but his grandfather had taught him about jungle sickness and heat ills common in West Africa, and the signs were much the same. "I know what is happening to her frame. Give her water, shade, and rest, or your boss loses his property." The simple money argument won over Reeves. He told them to bring water and had Sarah moved to the shade. She lived, and that night, Jabari had built something that would be vital to his life and power. He showed he had special skills that had value to the owners. People who had useful talents got slightly better care because killing them meant losing their help. Over the next several months, Jabari carefully made a name as someone who understood health and could tell when people were truly ill or just tired. He could not save everyone. The work was meant to kill regardless of care, but he saved enough lives that Crawford and Reeves started asking him for help, pulling him from the fields to check on sick people and give advice. This job gave Jabari something priceless: access to almost every captive person on the land and time to talk with them in private. The talks happened during health checks. Jabari would be checking someone for fever or cleaning a cut, and while he worked, he would speak softly. "What is your name?" "Your true name, not what they call you." "Where were you born? Do you recall your mother's name?" And he would store everything they told him, adding it to the mental vault he had been building since 1807. But he did more than just gather facts. He taught the same memory ways he had made at the Whitfield farm. "The stories you hold, teach them to your kids," he would say. "The names of those who came before you. Say them out loud when you are alone so they do not fade. They are trying to wipe away who we were. Do not let them." By 1820, Jabari had been on Crawford's Land for 6 years and had built another web of cultural protection involving at least 50 people. They met in tiny groups during Sunday breaks, ostensibly for church, but actually doing what were lessons in African history, speech, and identity. The mask was almost perfect. White owners often liked slave Christianity, thinking it made people more quiet. They never thought that people might use church to keep the exact kind of knowledge that Christianity was meant to replace. But Samuel Crawford saw more than Marcus Whitfield. In 1821, he noticed something that worried him. The older Africans seemed to be teaching something to the younger ones born in America. He could not quite see what was being taught, but he saw that kids who grew up with only English were suddenly using African words, that people who should have been totally broken showed signs of not quite revolt, but something else. Pride, maybe, or just the lack of that total mental defeat that good estate management needed. Crawford did not link this right to Jabari. The land had over 200 people, and tracking the reach of one person was almost impossible. But he did see that something had to change. So in 1822, he set a new rule. No groups of more than 5 people outside of work, no private talk during Sunday church, and surprise checks of the shacks to make sure nothing banned was being held or taught. These steps slowed Jabari's lessons, but did not end them. The circle simply changed, meeting in smaller groups, teaching with more care, making a secret code for talking about African history that sounded like Bible talk to white ears. The Kingdom of Our Fathers meant West African states. The Crossing meant the Middle Passage, the time before the chains meant life in Africa. White overseers heard what they thought they would, people talking of holy lands and soul walks while missing that real history and places were being saved. In 1825, something occurred that would lead to the event in 1844 that we started with. A Methodist preacher named Thomas Whitmore started doing church work among the people on farms in the area. Whitmore was a complex man. He truly thought slavery was meant to be, but also thought that people had souls that needed saving. So he went from farm to farm, doing services, teaching verses, and trying to make sure people got religious lessons. Whitmore's visits to Crawford's land made a chance that Jabari saw right away. Here was a white man who truly wanted to teach people to read, specifically to read the Bible. Whitmore held reading classes for any people their owners would let go, thinking that reading the Word was key to real change. Samuel Crawford, who was himself a firm Methodist, let about 20 people join these classes, including Jabari. This choice would be one of the most wrong moves Crawford ever made. Jabari learned to read with the drive of someone who knew this skill's power. The system kept people from reading because it allowed them to fake passes, read freedom papers, and learn about revolts in other places. A person who could read was a person who could teach himself about the world past the fence, and maybe lead others more effectively.